Ladies, have you struggled all your life with excess fat on various parts of your body? Have you tried exercise and changes to your diet and every kind of pill and potion that has promised weight loss with no success? Struggle no more. An amazing discovery has allowed the Lamar Laboratories to create a new type of soap that reduces any part of the body that you choose by merely bathing with it. You can reduce any single part of your body, such as a double chin or ungainly ankles, without affecting other parts of your body. Just lather up the part you want to reduce and watch the fat melt away day after day until you reach the attractive proportions you've always wished to have. Send your money order today for 1 cake or a set of 3 cakes to Lamar Laboratories at 48 Rupert Street, London. And then just sit back in your bathtub, use the soap as directed, and wait for the surprising results as the days go by.
The date was Sunday, July 17, 1842. The location was New York City. When New Yorkers got up that Sunday morning and opened their Sunday paper, no matter which publisher printed the paper, they saw this woodcut print and an amazing announcement. A genuine, real mermaid had been captured near the Fiji Islands in the South Pacific and was going to be presented to the public for viewing that week at the concert hall on Broadway for just a nominal admission fee. And that same Sunday, no matter where they happened to go in the city, there were pamphlets scattered that featured an even more titillating picture inside, shown here, and more details. 10,000 of the pamphlets had been printed up and distributed, and the pictures were enough to incite what one historical author has called Mermaid Mania in New York. Everyone was making plans to see this wonder. For, of course, the newspapers wouldn't print the ad if it wasn't true. So, what did they see when they paid their entrance fee later in the week? There were no live, bosomy young ladies with tails anywhere to be found. Just the dead, 3-foot-long, shriveled-up body you see here. But it did indeed seem to consist of a head and torso that looked like some version of a human, and have a bottom half that looked like some kind of fish. It even had breasts, although they were tiny and pendulous, not voluptuous. Which is just as well. With that face, it would be super creepy to see regular women's breasts on the thing. You've heard in modern times on the internet the term clickbait. That refers to ads that are written with great hyperbole to tell you about some amazing novelty to get you to click your mouse on the link. If you do, when you get to the next page, you discover you've become a victim of bait and switch. The thing you thought you might see is either not there at all or had obviously been greatly exaggerated. But you are now within sight of what that ad maker wanted you to see, something he has for sale. In the case of the so-called Fiji Mermaid, the clickbait's purpose was to get you to buy a ticket to see the mermaid, and tens of thousands paid for their tickets. You'd think this would be the beginning and end of the showing of the Fiji Mermaid. You'd think thousands would storm out and plan to run the dude out of town who lured them there with the hyperbole. But you'd think wrong. No, the audience didn't get to see some bosomy, sexy babe with a fishtail like they'd expected. But they did see a really strange creature no one had ever seen before. In fact, more than one. The man giving the presentation about the mermaid also brought along samples of other strange animals, including a taxidermied duckbill platypus. Few, if any, New Yorkers had ever seen a platypus, even in a picture. It must have looked to them like a fake animal sewn together with mixed-up body parts, including fur, a duckbill and webbed feet, and a beaver tail. As a matter of fact, when the first taxidermied platypuses were brought to England in the 1600s, even some scientists thought they were a hoax. But the platypus the man in New York showed was obviously a whole animal with just odd body parts. And some local scientists had said they examined the Fiji mermaid closely and could not discern any hoax, could not find any hint that she had been sewn together. That doesn't mean everyone agreed, of course. There were doubters, including many scientists, who thought some taxidermists had done a really great job of putting together the body parts. But there was enough disagreement in the papers between so-called experts that the subject was open for discussion. And discussed it was. So no, this wasn't the end at all. The Fiji mermaid had an ongoing career, and therein lies an amazing tale about human nature. But the story doesn't really start that day in 1842, nor in England. Our story starts in 1639 on a small artificial island called Dejima, just offshore of the Japanese city of Nagasaki, connected to the city by a little bridge. Here's an early picture of it. The red, white, and blue flags you see over Dejima and on the boat are Dutch flags. That's because in 1639, Japan forbade any Western foreigners other than the Dutch, and specifically the Dutch East India Company, to land ships in Japan and be involved in trade. The Portuguese had been welcomed at one point, but a religious dispute over proselytizing resulted in them being ejected, along with any Western Christian country, other than the Dutch, who promised to play by the rules. Here's how Wikipedia describes the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was a chartered company established in 20 March 1602 by the States General of the Netherlands, amalgamating existing companies into the first joint stock company in the world, granting it a 21-year monopoly to carry out trade activities in Asia. Shares in the company could be bought by any resident of the United Provinces, and then subsequently bought and sold in open-air secondary markets, one of which became the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. It is sometimes considered to have been the first multinational corporation. It was a powerful company, possessing quasi-governmental powers, including the ability to wage war, imprison and execute convicts, negotiate treaties, strike its own coins, and establish colonies. And here's how Wiki describes Dejima of that era. On the administrative level, the island of Dejima was part of the city of Nagasaki. The 25 local Japanese families who owned the land received an annual rent from the Dutch. Dejima was a small island, 390 feet by 246 feet, barely 2 acres, linked to the mainland by a small bridge guarded on both sides and with a gate on the Dutch side. It contained houses for about 20 Dutchmen, warehouses, and accommodation for Japanese officials. The Dutch were watched by several Japanese officials, gatekeepers, night watchmen, and a supervisor with about 50 subordinates. Numerous merchants supplied goods and catering, and about 150 interpreters served. They all had to be paid by the Dutch East India Company. Every ship that arrived in Dejima was inspected. Its sails were held by the Japanese until they released the ship to leave. They confiscated religious books and weapons. Christian churches were banned on the island, and the Dutch were not allowed to hold any religious services. Despite the financial burden of maintaining the isolated outpost on Dejima, the trade with Japan was very profitable for the Dutch, initially yielding profits of 50% or more. All of this continued on until the early 1850s, when the U.S. sent Commodore Perry to initiate gunboat diplomacy in order to force Japan to agree to trade with the U.S. and the Western world in general. It was effective, and a treaty was signed in 1854, which opened some Japanese ports to the U.S. and others, and Dejima was no longer needed. But our story continues its details in the period before that treaty. In about 1820, the same time period shown in this painting of Dejima, a Dutch ship spent some time at the port. While there, one of the U.S. seamen purchased a souvenir. It was a taxidermied body of a creature about 3 feet long that appeared to have a head and torso similar to humans, but the bottom half of its body was just like a fish. Yes, it was the Fiji mermaid that we met earlier in our story. We have no record of what that seaman paid for the object, nor whether he believed it to be real or created by the artistic talents of a proficient Japanese taxidermist. Perhaps like the taxidermy-created jackalopes sold as souvenirs in the U.S. West right up to today, a mixed-up animal with the head and body of a long-eared jackrabbit, but with antlers like a deer or antelope. No one really believes bunnies have horns, but the illusion is very effective and makes a fun souvenir. But I'm suspicious that way back in the early 1800s, the Dutch seaman and his shipmates thought that mixed-up creature was the real thing. It may be the first one of its type ever seen by a Westerner, but it was not the first of its kind. Skilled Japanese craftsmen have been making these figures for centuries, mostly sold as objects used in religious activities at temples. They were very good at this, and it was very difficult to tell where and how the parts were connected together. The creatures were very convincing. While on the seas headed back to Europe, the Dutch merchant ship carrying the seaman and the sea creature sank during a storm. A nearby United States ship, captained by an American named Samuel Barrett Eads, rescued the crew and the sea creature, which by now was being referred to by everyone as a mermaid. It would appear from the record that Captain Eads was totally taken in by the craftsmanship of the creature and believed it to be an honest-to-goodness mermaid. An ugly one, mind you, but nonetheless a creature never captured before. He became so obsessed by the mermaid that he offered to buy it. The seaman owner, evidently realizing that Eads wanted it because he believed it to be real, demanded a purchase price of $6,000. That would be the equivalent in buying power of over $150,000 in the 21st century, considering inflation over the centuries. Eads, evidently convinced he could make a fortune far larger than that by charging admission to people to have a look at the creature, decided to pay the price. He sold the boat he was on and all its cargo and bought the mermaid. As expected, he spent the next couple of years exhibiting the item, first in South Africa, then in England. He didn't use any major advertising gimmicks to get people to come and see it, and didn't seem to be interested in luring them in with a bait and switch like the later presentation of the mermaid in New York. And he didn't rent big halls to show it, nor have an elaborate show built around it. In 1822, he just set up shop at the Turf Coffee House on St. James Street in London and charged a shilling per person for visitors to view it displayed under a thick glass dome. This simple ad, with a sketch of the front and back of the mermaid, was made at that time and posted around London. Interest in the creature was high for a while, with some amateur scientists confirming it was the real thing. So for a while, Eads was making quite a profit. But eventually it was examined and exposed as a hoax by more competent scientists. The news made all the papers, with stories making it clear that those who saw it and accepted it as real were hopelessly gullible. Readers didn't like being labeled that way, and thus visits to the mermaid dwindled down to almost none. It had been a good draw for the coffee shop, so when the mermaid stopped making money, so did the coffee shop, and it had to shut down. Unfortunately, when selling the ship and cargo to buy the mermaid, Eads didn't make it clear he only had partial ownership of the boat. In fact, he only owned 1/8 of the value of the ship, with his partner owning 7/8. So at about the time interest in the mermaid waned, the other owner demanded his portion of the selling price, sued Eads, and, as noted in this newspaper report of the trial, Eads was required by the British courts to pay him back. By then, Eads had no reserves of money and thus spent the rest of his life, about 20 years, sailing the seas trying to make money to pay back the debt. He died 20 years later, penniless, except for still owning the mermaid. And when he died, the mermaid was passed down to his son as his only inheritance. For the next 20 years, the mermaid disappeared from public view. Evidently, the son wasn't as excited about it as his father had been. And that brings us back to when our story first started.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you plagued daily with a variety of ailments? Do you have rheumatic headaches or sciatica or joints deformed by arthritis or gout or numerous other health problems that may leave you feeling like a human wreck? Like thousands of others, you may be made completely well again just by ordering a supply of tiny, easy-to-swallow tablets and taking them for 5, 15, or 30 days, depending on the seriousness of your case. Each fuller celery pearl represents the medicinal value of 26 pounds of fresh golden celery. Run out to your favorite chemist shop today and pick up a package, or send for a free trial sample and booklet to Fuller's, 323 City Road, London. Be sure to include 2 stamps and your full name and address.
At this point, our story shifts to Boston, where a man named Moses Kimball in about 1840 met with Samuel Barrett Eads' son and purchased the mermaid from him. Evidently, the mermaid had not been exhibited in the U.S. at all at that point, and London was far enough away that a 20-year-old story about a fake mermaid seen there was not familiar to Americans. Moses Kimball was the proprietor of the Boston Museum. Wikipedia describes Moses Museum this way. The Boston Museum, from 1841 to 1903, also called the Boston Museum and Gallery of Fine Arts, was a theater, wax museum, natural history museum, zoo, and art museum. In addition to works of art, there were tableaux of wax figures, live animals, and theatrical performances. Early live shows presented, for instance, quote, the musical olio, consisting of solos on glass bells and birch bark whistling. At one point, John Wilkes Booth performed at the Boston Museum. An ad for the museum in 1850 describes some of its many offerings at that time this way. The museum is the largest, most valuable, and best arranged in the United States. It comprises no less than 7 different museums, to which has been added the present year, besides the constant daily accumulation of articles, 1/2 of the celebrated Peale's Philadelphia Museum, swelling the already immense collection to upwards of 500,000 articles, the greatest amount of objects of interest to be found together at any one place in America, and an entirely new hall of wax statuary, and the immense collection of birds, beasts, fish, insects, and reptiles, paintings, engravings, and statuary, Egyptian mummies, a family of Peruvian mummies, the duck-billed platypus, the curious half-fish, half-human Fiji mermaid, elephants, and orangutans. In other words, this wasn't like any regular museum you might have been to, like the Museum of Natural History in Chicago. It was more closely akin to a giant carnival or circus with sideshows under one roof attached to a giant flea market. In fact, it was also very, very closely akin to another such museum. Kimball's Boston Museum was a first cousin to Barnum's American Museum, founded and led by Phineas P.T. Barnum in New York City. It had started in 1841, the same year as the Boston Museum. Here's how Wiki describes Barnum's establishment by 1850. Its attractions made it a combination zoo, museum, lecture hall, wax museum, theater, and freak show. In what was, at the same time, a central site in the development of American popular culture, Barnum filled the American Museum with dioramas, panoramas, cosmoramas, scientific instruments, modern appliances, a flea circus, a loom powered by a dog, the trunk of a tree under which Jesus' disciples supposedly sat, an oyster bar, a rifle range, waxworks, glass blowers, taxidermists, phrenologists, pretty baby contests, Ned the Learned Seal, the Fiji Mermaid, midgets, Chang and Aang the Siamese twins, a menagerie of exotic animals that included beluga whales in an aquarium, giants, Native Americans who performed traditional songs and dances, Grizzly Adams trained bears, and performances ranging from magicians, ventriloquists, and blackface minstrels to adaptations of biblical tales and Uncle Tom's Cabin. At its peak, the museum was open 15 hours a day and had as many as 15,000 visitors a day. Some 38 million customers paid the 25 cents admission to visit the museum between 1841 and 1865. The total population of the United States in 1860 was under 32 million. If both museums would have been in the same town, Kimball and Barnum would no doubt have been great rivals. But since Boston and New York were over 200 miles apart, they drew totally different audiences. So they could afford to be friends instead. Good friends, not averse to sharing some of their exhibits at times, especially since they had so much in common in personality and style. Let's face it, they were both masters at humbuggery and hyperbole. Let's take a moment right here to explain a bit about the unusual word we just introduced, humbuggery. Humbug and humbuggery are words you seldom hear in the 21st century except in two settings. First, if you see a play or movie or TV show about Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol story, you will hear the main character, Ebenezer Scrooge, react to Christmas celebration in this way: Christmas, bah, humbug. Most people seem to think he meant something like silly nonsense or worthless. He didn't. That's not what humbug means. But what does it mean? The other time you might hear the word humbug is if you were watching the Judy Garland movie from 1939, The Wizard of Oz, based on a book written by L. Frank Baum in 1900. Near the end of the movie, Dorothy and her friends discover the wizard isn't a wizard at all. He's just a regular man who used trickery to deceive people into believing he had supernatural powers. They confront him with their discovery. At that point, the Scarecrow accuses him of being a humbug, and he agrees. But what's a humbug? Humbuggery is dishonest talk, writing, or behavior that is intended to deceive people. Similar words are hoax, con, flim-flam, and scam. A person who indulges in humbuggery is a humbug. Similar words are fraud, imposter, or deceiver. A scam or hoax a person who is a humbug may pull off is itself called a humbug, too. The various forms of humbug are particularly used when referring to someone who is targeting for deception not just another person or a small group of people. It's mainly used in hoaxes designed to publicly deceive a whole population of people. In Dickens' Christmas Carol, when confronted with the inconvenience to himself caused by the Christmas celebration, he harshly declares, "Christmas, bah, humbug." Most people in modern times don't really understand fully what he meant. Bah, humbug doesn't just mean I don't like this thing. It means he thinks Christmas was invented just to bother him and other industrious bosses like him by demanding the day off work, cutting into the boss's profits. It's a fraud created by people, not a celebration related to their religious beliefs. In other words, Scrooge is convinced that Christmas itself is a humbug. There is one other main source of modern people hearing the word humbug, if they read about the historical character of P.T. Barnum, the famous circus and museum entrepreneur. He proudly wore the label of greatest humbug on earth, as many of his most popular presentations in his circuses and museums were not legitimate, but tricks to deceive the public. They were humbugs. He was so obsessed with humbugs, he even wrote his own book, cataloging the history of some of the greatest humbugs of history as of his time. Which brings us back to the Fiji Mermaid owned by Kimball by 1842. He could have chosen to display it in his own museum at that point, but he knew that his friend P.T. Barnum was the country's best at advertising curiosities and getting big audiences. Both were just starting out in their museum businesses, and Moses decided to travel to New York and discuss with P.T. a joint American debut for the Mermaid starting in New York. But P.T. Barnum never did things in an orthodox way. He could have just put an ad in the paper that week, installed the mermaid in his museum, and started showing her. But he knew she'd just get lost in the shuffle of all the tens of thousands of items in the museum if he did that. Instead, he and Moses cooked up an elaborate, grand entrance for her to New York society. In other words, these two professional humbugs engaged in humbuggery by inventing an elaborate humbug. An article on the LiveScience.com website by Jesse Zele, titled "The Fiji Mermaid Early Barnum Hoax," describes how their plan progressed. Between the two of them, they engineered quite a story preceding the public presentation of the Fiji Mermaid. Barnum leased the mermaid from Kimball. The plan was cleverly crafted to incite at first just a little interest from the press, with made-up letters to the papers from people in distant states who claimed to have met a Dr. Griffin from the British Lyceum of Natural History in London and had seen his amazing creatures, including the mermaid. Interest escalated when Griffin arrived at a hotel in Philadelphia before his supposed return to London to take the mermaid to the Lyceum, and the press had to get a look. But there was no such institution as the British Lyceum of Natural History in London or anywhere else. And Dr. Griffin was not who he said he was. He was Levi Lyman, who had worked with Barnum on a hoax in 1835. But Dr. Griffin proved pivotal in the mermaid's success. At the time, new exotic animals from around the world really were being discovered by Westerners. Dr. Griffin showed the public other unusual animals, like the platypus, which seemed to offer proof that he was a naturalist and that the mermaid was real. Additionally, Dr. Griffin and Barnum appeared to have a public tiff, which aroused interest. Barnum wanted to exhibit the mermaid at his new American Museum, but Dr. Griffin refused. Barnum said he'd already created publicity materials for the mermaid and, supposedly unable to use them, gave them to the New York media to use. This made him look generous, but was really a devious way to promote the mermaid. It also angered the newspaper staffs, for each had been told they were the only outlet getting the publicity materials. Instead, on Sunday, July 17, 1842, identical advertisements for an exotic mermaid appeared in all the papers. Interestingly, the advertisements showed beautiful mermaids with the torsos of voluptuous human women, completely different than the Fiji mermaid's appearance. But given the mermaid's success, the public didn't seem to mind. Dr. Griffin's letters, the Philadelphia appearance, and the advertisements had New Yorkers desperate to see the mermaid. Following his and Barnum's plan, Dr. Griffin agreed to exhibit it for a week at the New York Concert Hall. Crowds flooded the exhibit where the fake naturalist gave lectures, stating that all land-dwelling animals have counterparts in the ocean, seahorses, sea lions, and so on. So it only followed that sea humans would exist. The local newspapers were wildly enthusiastic about the exhibit, as you can see from these two clippings from that week. The mermaid, caught near the Fiji Islands and now exhibiting for 3 days only at Concert Hall, 406 Broadway, is creating a wonderful excitement, thousands daily visiting it. A committee of scientific gentlemen yesterday examined it and not only pronounced it genuine, but decidedly the greatest wonder in the world. It positively cannot be seen after Saturday of this week. The mermaid, great excitement. The whole town seems to be flocking to see the mermaid, caught near the Fiji Islands and now exhibiting at Concert Hall, Broadway. This is the last day but one of the exhibition. Therefore, all ladies and gentlemen who are fond of the curious will bear it in mind. After a week at the New York Concert Hall, Dr. Griffin generously agreed to let Barnum show the mermaid at his American Museum. Attendance at the museum tripled. Once again, the local papers fussed over the success of the exhibit. The Mermaid, American Museum. Mr. Barnum, the indefatigable proprietor of the American Museum, has secured the mermaid for 1 week and will exhibit it without extra charge for that length of time. We understand the manager paid $1,000 for the privilege of exhibiting this queen fish 6 days and nights, but we have no doubt he will receive 6 times that amount during the week. And after that, ads kept extending the period the mermaid would be at Barnum, such as this one that promised 1 more week at the Barnum Museum. Because, of course, Barnum didn't want anyone to miss the great opportunity. Nobody seemed to notice when Dr. Griffin disappeared and never took the Fiji mermaid to the Lyceum in London, where he was supposedly originally headed, which is just as well since no such place existed. We'll be back with the finale to the case of the mermaid's tail in just a few moments, but first a final word from one of our sponsors.
Gentlemen, like these fellows, are your gray or white whiskers making you appear older than you wish to? Like them, have you tried other dyes to attempt to regain your dark brown or pitch black beard of your youth, but found that those other dyes leave your whiskers a mishmash of discoloration? Do you want to restore your youthful look? Look no further for a solution. Buckingham's dye for the whiskers guarantees a perfect dye process every time. Buckingham's dye is the gentleman's favorite because it never fails to color a uniform black or brown.
It was a particularly good idea they didn't show the mermaid first at Barnum's museum. He'd only opened the museum the year before, and he started out with a bit of bad publicity he had to overcome. He had started his career in public display of oddities in 1835 by offering to the public an opportunity to see a 161-year-old colored woman named Joyce Heth, a woman who had allegedly been nursemaid mammy to the infant and toddler George Washington. The woman was totally blind and had no teeth, but she was glib enough to regale the audience with stories of young George at Mount Vernon. This did stir up interest a bit for Barnum's effort, but after her death it became revealed that she was actually just about 70 years old. The public that was aware of this little venture had a pretty low level of respect for Barnum's veracity, so it was wise to not connect the Fiji mermaid with that reputation, at least right away. But within days, the Mermaid Mania in the city allowed her to make an appearance at Barnum's museum with no problem. After the concert hall appearance, Barnum rented her for $12.50 a week from Moses to display in his own museum for a while, and also sent her on a tour of the South under the care of his uncle, Alanson Taylor, starting in Charlotte, North Carolina. Here's an ad for that exhibition in Charlotte, but she started such a hullabaloo there that he had to make the trip personally to rescue her and bring her back to New York, cutting short the tour. The Live Science article describes what had happened. In Charleston, Taylor found himself at the center of a feud between 2 local newspapers. One attested to the mermaid's genuineness, while the other adamantly claimed the mermaid was a fraud and that the people of Charleston were idiotic to see it. Taylor was harassed publicly. The skeptics were led by the Reverend John Bachman, who threatened to destroy the mermaid. The rental lease between Barnum and Kimball stipulated that Barnum would take utmost care of the mermaid, so this threat worried Barnum. Though he initially tried to use the controversy to generate press and keep the tour going, Barnum ultimately realized that Taylor was not up to the task. The mermaid was returned to New York. This episode illustrates an important aspect of Barnum's development as a showman. He was able to recognize when the mermaid had had her run in a town. Barnum seems to have realized that he had crossed the line, perhaps a few too many times with the mermaid scheme. He speaks about regretting it when he was older, though he did show other mermaids during the years at the American Museum. After the Fiji mermaid was returned to a place among all the curiosities of the Barnum Museum, the public debate over her, bickering whether she was an outright fraud pulled off by Barnum, who knew she was fake, a real mermaid, or a fake that was so good that Barnum himself wasn't sure, all died down. Barnum, of course, knew better. He knew she was a very good fake. Her torso was, with the little pendulous breasts, was that of a young female orangutan. Her skull was that of a monkey, her teeth probably from a chimpanzee, and her bottom half likely a salmon. From then on, Barnum never advertised her as if she was certainly a real creature. He always worded descriptions such as the visitor could make up their own mind once they had seen her. For the next few years, she went back and forth, being exhibited alternately at the Boston Museum and Barnum's American Museum. The last public mention of her was in 1859 when she was at the Boston Museum. After that, the Boston Museum burned to the ground, and there's no evidence one way or the other whether she was rescued during the conflagration. Fear not, though. By 1854, Admiral Perry's gunboat diplomacy had opened up much more regular dispersal of Japanese items on the world market, and almost immediately there was a glut on the market of a wide variety of variations on the Barnum Kimball Fiji Mermaid crafted by the taxidermists of Japan, plus by some American taxidermists who started trying their own hand at creating believable Fijis. And thus the public began seeing them displayed at carnival midways and circus sideshows across the U.S. The circus and carnival proprietors seemed to have learned from Barnum, though, and seldom presented their own Fiji mermaid with advertising copy that insisted she was real. They also fell back on the "you decide" gimmick. Still, I'm guessing that an awful lot of rubes at country carnivals were absolutely convinced they had seen a real mermaid. A vast swath of American society is still gullible to this very day about some topics. But in the 1800s in particular, there indeed were many suckers born every minute.